The Atlantic, spring 1943. The night was heavy, the waves dull against the steel hull, and for a moment it seemed the ocean still belonged to the submariner. But silence can be a liar. In the headphones of the radio operator came a faint rustle, then short, sharp clicks. At first slow, then faster. The captain raised his eyes. The operator frowned. The clicks grew into an urgent rhythm. Metox, a crude wooden cross with wires on the conning tower, wired to a receiver inside, translated invisible radar pulses into sound. Those clicks were like heartbeats. German sailors called them the song of death. One submariner later wrote in his diary, "When the beeps doubled, you knew it was no longer a search. It was a sight. At that moment, someone out there in the darkness was looking directly at you." The commander gave the order. Crash dive, full power. But time was already gone. The sea exploded in white light. A lee light cut the night open, making the boat a helpless silhouette. It was a blow to the nerves, a young lieutenant remembered. Darkness no longer saved us. Even night had betrayed us. To understand the power of that moment, we need to recall how, just a year earlier, night had been the U-boat's greatest ally. By day, they hid beneath the waves, crawling slowly on electric motors, limited by their batteries. But at night, they surfaced. Diesel engines gave them speed, crews breathed fresh air, and the hunters above the waves were blind. British destroyers carried Aztec sonar, but sonar only heard what was under the surface. On the surface, the submarine was invisible. Early airborne radars worked on long wavelengths and lost their target as the aircraft drew close. In darkness, a pilot saw only black water. The U-boat had minutes to dive. So it was in 1940, in 1941. This was the happy time of Admiral Dönitz's fleet. German newspapers boasted, "The Atlantic is Germany's hunting ground." But by 1942, the Allies were closing the sky. A simple, almost naive invention changed everything. Engineers mounted a searchlight on a bomber, switched on only at the moment radar lost the target. It was the lee light. First a blip on the screen, then a blinding flare. Seconds later, depth charges. The Germans answered in kind. Wooden crosses with wires rose on the conning towers. They were Metox antennas, listening for enemy signals. In the operator's headphones came the warning ticks. Someone was probing the sea, and if the beep suddenly doubled, it meant you had already been found. "I slept beside the radio man," sailor Rolf Dietrich later remembered. "I woke up from those signals. They pounded in the skull harder than any alarm clock." That was the sound of fear. But the race of invention did not stop. Metox gave warning only against old radars. It could hear the long waves. But when the Allies shifted to centimetric frequencies, the receiver went silent. Lieutenant Hans Jensen recalled, "We crossed the Bay of Biscay at night. Metox was quiet. Suddenly the sky split in light, and bombs rained down. Only later we learned they had changed their wavelengths. We had gone deaf." The British ASV Mach 3, born from the bomber's H-2S radar, was the new weapon. No German detector could hear it. U-boats lost their seconds of escape. Commanders began to understand. The Atlantic was slipping away. Not because their men fought worse, but because the enemy could see in darkness while they could not. American newspapers in early 1943 reported, "The secret of night war is now ours. The submariners lose their cloak. The sea and night are no longer their allies." The captain, sitting with headphones pressed to his ears, knew this without reading the papers. Every click was a reminder. Radar was no longer just a machine. It was the symbol of the end of undersea dominance. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe slipped into all-out war, a British journalist wrote in the Daily Express, "The shadow that frightens us most is not the bomber above, but the submarine below." He was not exaggerating. For the second time in a generation, Britain's survival would depend on keeping the sea lanes open. The German Navy had been broken by the Treaty of Versailles, but Karl Dönitz rebuilt a weapon that seemed perfectly suited to Britain's weakness, the U-boat. They were small, cheap compared to a battleship, and terrifyingly efficient when used in packs. In 1940, British convoys moved across the Atlantic under thin escort. Destroyers were too few, and aircraft could not reach the mid-ocean gap. U-boat commanders called this zone the Black Pit. It was there, in those empty miles between Iceland, Newfoundland, and Ireland, that submarines stalked like wolves. A survivor of convoy SC-7 later remembered, The night was lit by fire. One ship after another burst into flame. The sea was filled with men screaming. We felt abandoned in the middle of the ocean. The tactic was simple and devastating. A single U-boat spotted a convoy, shadowed it, and sent a radio signal. Others converged. Soon, a pack of 5, 10, even 15 submarines attacked together. They surfaced at night, weaving between the merchant hulls, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. The Allies called it the wolfpack. The Germans simply called it Erfolg, success. By late 1940, Britain was losing nearly 300,000 tons of shipping every month. In the spring of 1941, the number rose to 500,000. In the bleakest weeks, some officials in Whitehall feared Britain might not survive the year. Churchill himself confessed after the war, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." In those years, the submariners felt untouchable. They traveled on the surface at night faster than any escort could chase. Batteries were charged, fresh air poured through the hatches, and the sea was theirs. A German captain later wrote, "We were lords of the Atlantic. We could appear anywhere, strike at any time. At night, on the surface, we felt invincible." Early radar sets on aircraft were clumsy and unreliable. The long-wave beams scattered, lost the target when close. A pilot over the Black Ocean saw nothing but water. By the time his instruments failed, the U-boat was already gone. To the men in the steel tubes, this was freedom. They smoked on deck, joked in the conning tower, even played gramophones while charging batteries. Night was their ally, and the ocean their weapon. The press in Berlin painted a triumphant picture. In 1941, the Nazi paper Völkischer Beobachter boasted, "England trembles at the approach of our submarines. The Reich's U-boat arm will choke the island into submission." It was propaganda, but for a time it seemed to reflect reality. The Allied convoys grew desperate. The Royal Navy scattered what escorts it had across hundreds of ships. Many freighters sailed with no protection at all. Losses mounted. Convoy HX-79 in October 1940 was torn apart. 12 ships sunk in one night. Convoy SC-42 in September 1941 lost 16. Merchant sailors whispered that boarding a freighter bound for Britain was signing a death warrant. And still the U-boat captains believed the war could be won here, beneath the waves. Admiral Dönitz insisted that 300 operational submarines would be enough to strangle Britain's lifeline. By 1942, his fleet was approaching that number. American entry into the war gave the Germans fresh hunting ground. Along the east coast of the United States, tankers burned within sight of shore. New Yorkers standing on Coney Island could see the glow of ships torpedoed offshore. Newspapers carried grim headlines. "Oil tanker ablaze off Virginia Beach. Merchantmen lost within sight of Miami." The German submariners called it the second happy time. One captain wrote in his patrol log, "The targets are plentiful, the seas are wide, and the enemy seems asleep." For 3 long years, the Atlantic was a battlefield tilted in Germany's favor. Britain staggered. Supplies of food, fuel, and weapons ran thin. Ships waited weeks to form convoys, and even then, many never arrived. This was the high tide of the U-boat war. The wolf packs owned the darkness, and their commanders believed no machine could change that balance. And yet, in the headphones of a radio operator, faint clicks began to tell a different story. The first sign of change came quietly. A U-boat crossed the Bay of Biscay under the cover of night. The Metox receiver sat humming in the conning tower, its wooden cross antenna cutting the sky. But the headphones whispered nothing, only silence. Suddenly, the heavens exploded in light. A bomber roared overhead, and depth charges tumbled into the sea. The submarine reeled under the shock. Later in his report, the captain wrote just one line: "We were attacked without warning. Metox gave no signal." It was the moment the Germans realized the enemy had leapt into a new world of technology. The secret was the cavity magnetron, a British invention carried across the Atlantic and shared with the Americans. With it came a new radar, the ASV Mach-3, working not on the old meter-length waves but on centimetric frequencies. The difference was profound. To the U-boat crew, the old signals were audible, the steady clicking in their headphones. They knew how to read the rhythm, to dive before the hunter arrived. But the new centimetric beam was invisible to Metox. It passed over their heads, silent, undetected. One German officer later admitted, "We felt blind. The radio receiver was useless. We sailed in darkness, and suddenly bombs fell around us. It was like fighting a ghost. For the Allies, it was a revolution. ASV Mach-3 radar could pick out the faint silhouette of a periscope or conning tower against the waves. It could lock onto a submarine long before the crew suspected danger. The blind spots of earlier sets were gone. Now the blip remained steady right up to the attack. And when the blip was about to vanish on the screen, the pilot flicked a switch. A searing white beam cut through the night. This was the Lee light. The weapon was almost laughably simple. A giant searchlight slung under the wing or belly of a patrol plane. But in practice, it was devastating. The radar guided the aircraft into position. At the last second, the light switched on, freezing the submarine in a blaze of white. A sailor remembered that moment vividly. The light blinded us. We saw the bomber's belly above, and then the water erupted. It was as if the sky itself had turned into a weapon. By early 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become a killing ground. U-boats leaving their bases in France faced a gauntlet of patrol aircraft, each armed with centimetric radar and the merciless Lee light. Losses mounted. Captains grew hesitant to surface, even at night. And yet, without surfacing, they could not fight. Batteries drained, air grew foul, men weakened. The ocean that had once been their shield now betrayed them. The German press said little of this change. Reports in Berlin spoke of temporary difficulties, of new Allied tricks. But in the logbooks of the U-boat arm, the truth was clear. The silent radars had stolen the night. A British paper captured the spirit in 1943. The wolf packs no longer hunt in darkness. The hunters of the air now see through the night, as if it were day. For 3 years, the submarines had ruled. Now, centimetric radar and the Lee light had flipped the balance. The clicks that once warned of danger were gone. Silence in the headphones meant not safety, but death approaching unseen. For the U-boat arm, coordination was everything. A single submarine could sink a ship, but a dozen, guided to the same convoy, could slaughter dozens in a night. That coordination depended on radio. One boat sighted a target, sent a signal, and others converged. In 1941, those signals were lifelines, the nervous system of the wolfpack. By 1943, they had become death sentences. The Allies had perfected a new trick, high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDF, or simply Huff-Duff. Each time a U-boat transmitted, the hiss of its signal was caught by aerials aboard escort ships. An operator spun a dial, listened for the peak, and fixed a bearing. One ship's reading was rough, 2 or 3 gave a cross, and within minutes, the wolf had become the hunted. A Royal Navy officer remembered, the Germans thought the ocean was theirs, but with Huff-Duff, every time they spoke, we heard them. Every time they called for help, we could set a trap. The genius of Huff-Duff was its speed. Before, direction finding had been slow, clumsy, done at shore stations with precious little coordination. Now the escort destroyer itself carried the equipment. Convoys moved with an invisible shield. The instant a transmission flared on the ether, escorts could swing to intercept. One American commander explained to a reporter, "They had to talk to fight. We made it so that talking meant dying." For the German captains, the change was bewildering. They followed the old drill, shadow a convoy, send a contact report, and wait. But increasingly, escorts appeared on the horizon within the hour. Depth charges rolled into the sea. The trap closed before the pack could form. Admiral Dönitz complained bitterly in his diary, "The enemy finds our boats too quickly. He strikes before they can assemble. It is as if the ocean itself betrays us." Wolf packs had once turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. Now they withered under the invisible hand of radio. HFDF stripped away the advantage of surprise. Convoys that might once have been massacred now slipped through with only a loss or two. The men aboard merchant ships noticed the difference. One sailor wrote to his wife in 1943, "We no longer steam alone into death. The escorts are everywhere. The U-boats still come, but not in packs. They are scattered, disorganized, and they fall one by one." Combined with centimetric radar and the merciless searchlight of the Lee light, Huff-Duff closed the jaws of the trap. For the first time in the war, it was the U-boat commanders who felt hunted, and their great weapon, the pack itself, was slipping from their grasp. Convoys had always been the key. A single freighter steaming alone was a target painted on the sea. 100 freighters moving together, ringed by escorts, could at least fight back. But early in the war, convoy defense was crude. Escorts trailed behind, clumsy in coordination, and depth charges were a blunt instrument. Too often the sea boiled with explosions while the submarines slipped away unharmed. By 1943, that had changed. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy had turned escort work into a science. Destroyers and corvettes no longer followed but spread ahead, forming a screen that moved like a single body. Air patrols filled the skies wherever range allowed. And when radar or huff-duff gave a bearing, escorts struck with deadly precision. The difference lay not just in tactics, but in technology. Depth charges had long been the weapon of choice. Canisters rolled off the stern set to explode at guessed depths. But the explosions themselves blinded the sonar. The sea frothed with bubbles, the echoes vanished, and contact was lost. The answer was a new device, the Hedgehog. It looked almost laughable, a rack of stubby spigots mounted on the forecastle of an escort. But when fired, they spat out a pattern of 24 bombs in a graceful arc ahead of the ship. Each bomb was small, contact-fused. If it hit, it detonated. If it missed, it sank quietly. No wasted explosions, no blinding froth. One captain described it. With depth charges, we guessed. With the Hedgehog, we hunted. The psychological effect was brutal. A U-boat commander once said, "The Hedgehog was worse than charges. You heard nothing until the bomb struck. Then you knew it was over." Convoy battles began to follow a new rhythm. A U-boat drawn in by radio signals would be detected before it could strike. A corvette closed in, sonar holding the contact, Hedgehog ready. The pattern leapt into the water, a silent rain of steel. Moments later came the dull thump of an underwater explosion. One submarine less. The statistics told the story. In 1942, only a fraction of depth charge attacks resulted in a kill. By late 1943, Hedgehog-equipped escorts more than doubled the success rate. In some groups, nearly 1 in 3 attacks ended with a submarine destroyed, and the Allies did not stop there. Escort carriers, tiny flat tops converted from merchant hulls, sailed with the convoys carrying a handful of Wildcats and Avengers. For the first time, aircraft could prowl the mid-Atlantic gap, denying the wolfpacks their sanctuary. One merchant sailor remembered his relief. "We saw planes overhead, even in the middle of the ocean. It meant we were not alone anymore." The convoy had become a fortress. Radar in the air, huff-duff on the ships, Hedgehogs on the bows, and aircraft above. The ocean was no longer an empty hunting ground. It was a gauntlet bristling with weapons, a system of defense that closed tighter with each passing month. For the U-boat captains, the message was clear. What had once been a war of ambush was becoming a war of annihilation. Every attack risked not just failure, but destruction. And the men in the steel coffins knew it. The Battle of the Atlantic had raged for nearly 4 years. For most of that time, the U-boats had seemed unstoppable. But in May 1943, the balance collapsed almost overnight. Convoy ONS-5 was the breaking point. It sailed from Liverpool to Halifax, a slow convoy of merchantmen heavy with cargo. In late April, wolfpacks gathered to strike. 40 U-boats converged, one of the largest concentrations of the war. The battle raged for days. Ships burned, torpedoes struck, and the Atlantic once again filled with cries in the dark. But this time the outcome was different. Escorts, guided by Huff-Duff, intercepted the submarines. Aircraft from escort carriers circled overhead. Hedgehogs and depth charges hammered the sea. By the end, ONS-5 had lost 13 ships. But the U-boats had lost 7 in a single convoy battle, a cost they could not bear. An officer from the 2nd Escort Group wrote, "We felt the shift. For once, it was not us clinging on while the enemy circled. It was they who could not escape, and ONS-5 was only the beginning." In May, convoy after convoy crossed the Atlantic under the new shield of technology and tactics. The wolfpacks attacked, but the hunters were waiting. 23 U-boats were destroyed in just the first 2 weeks. By month's end, 41 were gone, nearly a quarter of Donitz's entire operational force. The statistics were stark. In March 1943, Allied losses had peaked, more than 600,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. In May, sinkings dropped by half, while U-boat losses reached a level no fleet could sustain. One German captain recalled the despair. "We attacked as before, but we died as never before. We could not understand how they found us so quickly, how they struck with such certainty. Dönitz saw the truth. On May 24th, he issued the order to withdraw. The wolfpacks left the North Atlantic, the hunting grounds they had ruled for 3 years. German radio called it a temporary redeployment, but the men who had sailed the steel coffins knew better. They called it Der Schwarze Mai, Black May, the month the Atlantic turned against them. A British paper reported with grim satisfaction, "The wolves retreat. The ocean, once their domain, is theirs no longer." From that moment, the Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but its outcome was certain. Never again would the U-boats threaten Britain with starvation. Never again would the wolf packs prowl the sea with confidence. In the headphones of the radio operator, the clicks had once been warnings. By Black May, the silence was worse, for silence meant death, unseen, inescapable, and final. Defeat in May 1943 did not end the U-boat war overnight. The submarines still slipped into the Atlantic, and some ships were still lost. But for Admiral Dönitz, the challenge had shifted. The question was no longer, how do we win? It was, how do we survive? The Germans tried everything. They mounted heavy anti-aircraft guns on their decks, creating so-called flak boats. The idea was simple: fight the patrol planes instead of diving from them. But the results were disastrous. A few aircraft were shot down, but every minute spent on the surface under fire was a minute too long. Bombs and rockets found their mark. One survivor said bitterly, "We became targets in the sky's shooting gallery." Engineers raced to invent new detectors. Metox was obsolete, but soon came Naxos, tuned to hear centimetric radar. Crews carried hope in their ears once again. But the Allies advanced faster. By the time Naxos reached the boats, Allied radars had grown stronger, stealthier, and far more numerous. The snorkel was another answer. Borrowed from Dutch designs, it allowed a submarine to run its diesels while submerged, drawing in air through a pipe that jutted above the waves. On paper, it made the U-boat invisible, hiding it from radar. In practice, it was unreliable. The snorkel banged with each wave, choking the engines. The crew endured foul air, condensation dripping from the steel. Men grew sick, their skin pale and clammy. A sailor wrote in his diary, "We hid like rats, breathing poison, waiting for the storm to pass." The torpedoes, too, grew more advanced. The Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedo promised to chase the sound of propellers, to strike an escort with deadly precision. But the Allies adapted quickly. They towed noisemakers, foxers, that lured the torpedoes away. What was meant as a wonder weapon became another disappointment. The Germans experimented with new tactics: lone raiders instead of packs, bold surface charges at convoys, even attempts to attack with rockets from under the waves. Nothing changed the outcome. The ocean was saturated with escorts, carriers, and patrol planes. Every improvement the U-boat arm made was answered by 2 from the Allies. One captain later admitted, "It was like trying to patch a sinking ship. Every new tool we received was already too late." By 1944, the U-boat service was a shadow of itself. Losses remained terrible. Morale crumbled. Young recruits, barely trained, sailed into missions from which most would never return. A sailor from the 11th Flotilla recalled, "We knew we would not come back. We went anyway. What else was there?" The countermeasures were too little, too late. The silent radars, the merciless convoys, the fortress in the sky, all had combined to break the back of the U-boat fleet. And still the captains listened to their headphones, praying for the warning clicks that never came. Numbers alone cannot explain the Battle of the Atlantic. To understand it, we must enter the cramped hulls, smell the diesel, and hear the voices of the men who lived and died beneath the waves. One such voice belonged to Kapitän Lieutenant Jürgen Oesten. He recalled a night in 1943 when his Metox suddenly came alive. The headphones chattered with rapid clicks. He ordered a dive, but moments later the sky split open with a lee light. Bombs hammered the sea around him. Somehow, the boat escaped. Years later, Oesten admitted, "That was when I knew the war had changed. We no longer hunted. We were hunted." For sailors, life on a U-boat was a constant test of endurance. The space was so tight that men slept in shifts, stacked like cordwood in bunks. The air was heavy with oil, sweat, and stale bread. When the snorkel came, it only made things worse. Dampness dripping from the steel, lungs burning from exhaust fumes. One young radio man wrote to his parents but never posted the letter. The smell clings to us. I dream of clean air. But when the clicks come in the headphones, I think only of diving faster than death. Fear was a constant companion. Veterans described the pings of Allied sonar echoing through the hull. Each metallic knock meant that a destroyer's ears were upon them. After the pings came the depth charges. The sea roared, bulkheads shivered, light bulbs shattered. A survivor recalled, "You could not pray. You could only clench your teeth and wait for the next explosion." And yet, in rare moments, there was humanity. Some captains allowed music to be played. A gramophone spun scratched records, muffled tunes filling the steel chamber. One sailor wrote, "We played Schubert as the bombs fell. It was madness, but it kept us sane." Not all stories ended in survival. By 1943, the life expectancy of a U-boat crew was measured in weeks. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, more than 30,000 would never return. It was one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of service in the war. A British escort captain later reflected, "We feared them once, and rightly so. But by the end, they were boys sent to die in coffins. We pitied them even as we destroyed them." In memoirs written decades later, many former submariners described the same feeling: the clicks, the light, the silence. One put it simply, "When I hear a radar ping in a harbor demonstration today, my stomach still knots. The sound carries me back to the Atlantic." These were not faceless enemies, but men caught in a machine larger than themselves. They fought, they endured, and they died in steel shells beneath the waves. And for many of them, the last thing they heard was not the roar of engines or the crash of the sea, but the quiet, insistent rhythm of a radar pulse, spelling the end of their world. Behind every radar ping, behind every sonar pulse, stood an engineer with a pencil, a chalkboard, and a restless mind. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought only with torpedoes and depth charges. It was fought in laboratories, in universities, in small workshops where sparks flew and ideas became weapons. In Britain, the magnetron was the miracle. At the University of Birmingham, physicists John Randall and Harry Boot built a device that shrank radar waves to a few centimeters. This tiny tube, glowing with heat, changed the face of the war. One scientist later said, "It was as if we had given sight to the blind." Shipped in secrecy across the Atlantic, the magnetron became the beating heart of Allied radars. American factories turned out sets by the thousands. Aircraft carried them over the Bay of Biscay. Destroyers mounted them on their masts. Escort carriers used them to patrol the mid-ocean gap. Suddenly, the darkness of the Atlantic was lit with invisible eyes. The Germans worked just as feverishly. In Kiel and Berlin, technicians labored over countermeasures. Metox was their first answer, a crude wooden cross listening for the long-wave signals. When centimetric radar appeared, they built Naxos, tuned for the new frequencies. But every time the Germans caught up, the Allies had already leapt ahead. One German engineer interviewed after the war confessed, "We were always too late. By the time our devices reached the boats, the enemies had already changed." In America, laboratories buzzed with innovation. Bell Labs perfected sonar arrays that could pick up the faintest echoes. MIT's radiation laboratory became a factory of ideas, churning out blueprints for new radar sets, test models, and prototypes. The collaboration between scientists and sailors was constant. Engineers rode on destroyers to test their inventions in real combat. Sailors carried back feedback to refine the tools. Even the Hedgehog had its roots in engineering imagination. British ordnance experts, frustrated with depth charge failures, designed a weapon that leapt ahead of the ship rather than falling behind. They tested it with chalk marks on blackboards, then with wooden models in tanks, before finally mounting it on steel decks. Factories across Britain and America became battlefields of production. Women riveted radar mounts, men wired delicate circuits, and entire towns turned out components. Each set that left the factory doors meant another submarine's doom. For the sailors at sea, these inventions were lifeline. A radar scope glowing in the darkened cabin, a sonar pulse echoing back with the outline of a submarine, a hedgehog pattern erupting silently, then delivering a fatal thump. For the U-boat crews, it felt like black magic. One captain recalled, "We thought the enemy had demons on their side. They saw us when we could not see them. They struck us in the dark as if guided by fate." In truth, it was not demons, but engineers, Men and women who bent physics to their will, who turned equations into survival. They never set foot in a submarine's conning tower or heard the shriek of depth charges above. But their work, their inventions, tilted the Atlantic until the wolves were no longer hunters, but prey. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not in a single day, nor by a single convoy. It was won by persistence, by invention, and by the quiet pulse of invisible waves crossing dark water. For the U-boat captains, the radar ping became the sound of defeat. At first faint, almost ignorable, then constant, relentless. Each signal in the headphones was another reminder that the ocean was no longer theirs. For the Allies, radar meant survival. Britain could eat, factories could run, troops could sail. Every freighter that reached port carried not only supplies, but the promise that the war could go on, that the island fortress would not starve. Historians often describe the atomic bomb as the war's great technological leap. Yet many of them also note that centimetric radar was just as decisive, if less dramatic. Without it, convoys might have been strangled, Britain cut off, and the Normandy invasion delayed or impossible. The legacy of radar extended far beyond 1945. In the Cold War, navies built ships bristling with radar arrays, their spinning dishes scanning the skies and seas. Submarines became quieter, stealthier, but sonar grew sharper in reply. The duel of detection and counter-detection born in the Atlantic became a permanent feature of modern war. Civil life, too, was transformed. The same magnetron that once pulsed across the ocean now hums in kitchens around the world, heating food in microwave ovens. Air traffic control, weather forecasting, even the simple act of watching planes land safely on runways, all owe their lineage to that frantic race to outwit the U-boats. For the men who lived it, though, the memory was more intimate. A German sailor, interviewed decades later, admitted, "When I hear a radar beacon at an airport today, I still flinch. The sound carries me back to the Atlantic, back to the fear." And yet, in those same sounds lay hope. Hope for convoys that made landfall, for families that were fed, for soldiers who marched on because their supplies had not sunk beneath the waves. The Battle of the Atlantic was, at its core, a battle of endurance. Steel against steel, ship against submarine, but also scientist against scientist, signal against silence. The day the first U-boat captain heard the radar pings, he knew the truth. The ocean, once his hunting ground, was no longer his.